Welcome back to Hacker News Daily, where we break down the top stories that got the tech community talking. I'm your host, and wow, did we have some heavy hitters yesterday. Out of 30 stories that crossed the Hacker News front page, we've pulled the 5 that really captured everyone's attention. And let me tell you, the range is wild. We've got a massive supply chain attack that might have just compromised, well, basically the entire JavaScript ecosystem. We're talking about how AI is helping developers tackle 25-year-old code that nobody wants to touch. Signal's finally addressing their biggest user complaint with a controversial solution. And we'll dive into some serious real-world implications of digital surveillance and social media restrictions that are playing out right now. So buckle up. This is what had everyone clicking, commenting, and debating yesterday on Hacker News. All right, so we need to talk about something that's got the entire JavaScript community on edge right now. NPM, debug, and chalk packages were compromised, and this is a big one, folks. We're talking about packages with literally billions of downloads per week that got injected with malicious code designed to steal cryptocurrency. So here's what went down. On September 8th, 2025, 18 of the most popular NPM packages you've probably got in your projects right now, debug, chalk, and 16 others, they all got compromised simultaneously. And when I say popular, I mean debug alone gets 357 million downloads every single week. Chalk, almost 300 million. Combined, these packages pull over 2 billion downloads weekly. That's billion with a B. The attack itself was pretty sophisticated. The malware was specifically designed to run on client websites, and it would silently intercept any crypto or Web3 transactions happening in the browser. What's really clever and terrifying is how it worked. The malware actually uses something called Levenshtein distance algorithms to pick wallet addresses that look visually similar to the real ones. You know how most people just check the first and last few characters of a wallet address? Yeah, this exploit was designed specifically to defeat that habit. It would swap in an address that looks almost identical unless you're checking every single character. Now here's where it gets interesting. The maintainer who got compromised actually came forward and admitted they got phished. And you know what? The community response has been surprisingly supportive. Instead of pitchforks and torches, people are focusing on the real problem here: NPM's complete lack of basic security infrastructure.
Think about this for a second. NPM, which is owned by GitHub, which is owned by Microsoft, one of the largest tech companies in the world, doesn't have code signing. They don't enforce 2FA for popular package maintainers. They apparently don't have any kind of automated detection for when a package suddenly starts doing sketchy stuff with crypto wallets. Several commenters pointed out that NPM has access to all this data. They can see everything happening on their platform, and yet, nothing. No warnings, no automatic flags, no security measures that could have caught this before it affected potentially millions of websites. One comment that really stuck with me was from someone who said their old manufacturing company used to block GitHub entirely and required months-long approval processes for any external code. Everyone thought they were paranoid dinosaurs, but looking at this incident, maybe they had a point. When you've got financial applications running on top of this house of cards, and there's zero liability when things go wrong, it does feel a bit reckless. The password manager debate that sparked from this is fascinating too. Several people pointed out that if the maintainer had been using a password manager, it wouldn't have auto-filled credentials on the phishing site. It's such a simple thing, but it could have prevented this entire catastrophe. We're talking about maintainers of critical infrastructure packages here, and apparently, some of them aren't even using basic security tools. What really gets me is the coordination of this attack. 18 packages compromised at the same time? That's not some script kiddie stumbling into a weak password. This was either a highly sophisticated operation that managed to phish multiple maintainers simultaneously, or And this is the scary thought. Maybe it was an insight threat, someone with access to multiple accounts or NPM's infrastructure itself. The implications here are staggering. If you're running any JavaScript application that handles money or sensitive data, and let's be real, that's basically every modern web app, you're potentially affected. The malicious code was obfuscated, it was targeted, and it was designed to be invisible to users. Your crypto could be getting redirected and you wouldn't even know it unless you're manually verifying every single character of every wallet address. Some commenters are calling this potentially the largest supply chain attack in JavaScript ecosystem history. And yeah, I can't really argue with that. 2 billion downloads a week means this touched everything. Your banking app, your favorite online store, that Web3 startup you've been working on. They're all potentially compromised.
The really frustrating part is that this was preventable. We're not talking about some zero-day exploit or advanced persistent threat here. This was phishing. Good old-fashioned click this link and enter your password phishing in 2025 against maintainers of critical infrastructure. And it worked because we don't have the basic security measures in place that should be table stakes by now. You know, speaking of dealing with code that nobody wants to touch, that NPM situation shows us what happens when critical infrastructure gets neglected. But sometimes the old code that needs attention isn't malicious, it's just ancient. And that brings us to our next story, where someone used Claude Code to modernize a 25-year-old kernel driver. And honestly, this one really caught my eye because it perfectly captures this intersection of nostalgia, practical problem solving, and the evolving role of AI in software development. So here's the setup. We've got a data recovery hobbyist who needs to pull data off these ancient QIC-80 tape cartridges from the 1990s. And if you're not familiar with these, they were these quirky little tape drives that, well, they were kind of a beautiful hack, actually. Instead of using expensive SCSI adapters like most tape drives of the era, these things connected directly to your floppy disk controller. Yeah, the same controller running your 3.5-inch floppy drive could also handle these tape drives on the same ribbon cable. It was this clever, cost-saving measure that made tape backups accessible to regular PC users, but it also meant the drivers had to do all sorts of weird, non-standard stuff to manipulate hardware I/O ports directly. Fast forward to today, and our author has a problem. The only way to read these tapes is using this Intent F tape driver that requires booting into CentOS 3.5. We're talking about a Linux distribution that's practically archaeological at this point. So what does he do? He turns to Claude Code to help modernize this 25-year-old kernel driver. And it actually worked. What I love about this story is how it triggered this massive discussion on Hacker News. 855 points, 287 comments about what AI coding assistants are actually good for. The consensus seems to be that tools like Claude are incredible force multipliers for experienced developers. You've got people in the comments sharing stories about using it to migrate entire frameworks, tackle unfamiliar code bases, even write kernel modules they wouldn't have attempted otherwise. But here's the key thing everyone keeps emphasizing. You need to know what you're doing. You can't just throw code at Claude and expect magic. There's this great comment thread where someone points out that Claude behaves less like a fellow engineer and more like an eager-to-please intern who's overconfident and quick to apologize when wrong. And you know what? That's actually a pretty apt description. The tool works best when you're experienced enough to guide it, validate its outputs, and know when it's hallucinating nonsense versus producing something genuinely useful. But what really struck me was this romantic element the author brings up. He talks about the tactile sensation of holding these old tapes, how there's something joyful about the whole process. And I get it. There's something deeply satisfying about rescuing data from obsolete media, about keeping these old systems alive and functional. It's preservation work, really. The technical achievement here is genuinely impressive, too. We're talking about modernizing kernel-level code that directly manipulates hardware, dealing with protocols that were never properly standardized,
all to interface with hardware that hasn't been manufactured in decades. The fact that magnetic tape from the 1990s is still readable today, despite these drives being, as the article notes, notorious for their many design flaws, that's actually remarkable. It speaks to the longevity of magnetic storage when you compare it to, say, how many CDRs from that era have already degraded beyond recovery. Now, there's an interesting tension in the comments about AI-generated code in open-source projects. One commenter mentions being banned from a project that explicitly prohibits AI-generated contributions in their code of conduct. And this raises fascinating questions about attribution, code quality, and what it means to write code in 2024.
The broader implication here is that AI tools are lowering the activation energy for certain types of contributions. That kernel driver modernization, the author might never have attempted it without Claude. Those framework migrations people are tackling, same story. We're seeing developers venture into unfamiliar territory because they have this AI safety net, or maybe AI climbing partner is a better metaphor. You're still doing the climb, you still need the skills, but now you've got someone or something to help you find the next handhold. And honestly, I think that's where we're headed with these tools. Not AI replacing programmers, but AI making programmers braver, more ambitious, more willing to tackle that intimidating legacy code base or try that unfamiliar language. The QIC80 tape driver story is just one example, but it's a perfect one. Using cutting-edge AI to breathe new life into decades-old technology, bridging past and future in this really elegant way. Speaking of preserving things from the past, that tape driver story was about saving old data. But what about saving our current conversations? Signal users have been struggling with this exact problem for years, and they're finally getting a solution, though not everyone's happy about how it's being implemented. All right, so our next story is something that's been a long time coming for Signal users, Signal Secure Backups. And wow, did this one stir up some feelings in the Hacker News community, with 667 points and over 300 comments. You know, it's funny, for years, Signal has been this fortress of privacy, right? End-to-end encryption, no compromises, the whole 9 yards. But there's been this one massive Achilles heel that's driven users absolutely crazy. If you lost your phone or switched devices, poof, all your messages were gone forever. No recovery, no backup, nothing. I've actually had friends refuse to use Signal specifically because of this, which is kind of ironic when you think about it. They'd rather use less secure messaging apps just because they could keep their chat history. Well, Signal's finally addressing this with their new secure backup feature, and they're doing it in a very Signal way, maintaining that end-to-end encryption while giving users the ability to preserve their conversations. It's rolling out first on Android beta, and here's how it works. You get automatic daily backups that are completely encrypted, and Signal offers a free tier that includes all your text messages plus 45 days worth of media. Want to keep all your photos and videos forever? That'll be $199 a month. And this is where things get really interesting. This is Signal's first ever paid feature. Think about that for a second. They've been running as a nonprofit, completely free, surviving on donations. And now they're introducing a subscription model. It's a fascinating shift that's got people talking about the sustainability of privacy-focused services. Can you really maintain a high-quality, secure service purely on donations? Or do you eventually need to find revenue streams that don't compromise your values? The Hacker News discussion around this is, well, it's complicated. On one hand, you've got people who are thrilled. Finally, they can back up their Signal messages without jumping through ridiculous technical hoops. There's this one user who described their current backup process on iOS, and it involves jailbreaking, using third-party tools, extracting SQLite databases. I mean, come on, that's not a backup solution. That's a computer science project. But then you've got the other camp who are frustrated about the implementation. The biggest complaint? Why can't we just use our own storage? People are already paying for iCloud, Google Drive, Dropbox. Why should they pay Signal another $2 a month when they've got terabytes of storage sitting unused? It's a fair point, honestly.
The technical answer is probably about maintaining control over the encryption and ensuring the backups remain secure, but from a user perspective, it does feel a bit restrictive. What really caught my attention in the comments was the horror stories about cross-platform migration. Apparently, if you switch from iPhone to Android or vice versa, you're still out of luck. You lose everything. Multiple users shared their pain about losing years of conversations when switching phones. One person mentioned they had to keep an old Android phone running just to reference old Signal conversations because they couldn't transfer them to their new iPhone. That's not a great user experience. There's also this interesting philosophical divide in the comments. You've got one user, Roger Kirkness, who basically said, I don't even want backups. I use Signal specifically because messages disappear, and anything important goes in email. It's a totally valid perspective that kind of highlights the different ways people think about messaging. Are your chats ephemeral conversations that should fade away, or are they a record you want to preserve?
The pricing model itself is generating some debate too. $2 a month for unlimited media backup? Is that reasonable? Some users think it's totally fair for what you're getting, especially considering Signal's nonprofit status and their commitment to privacy. Others are comparing it to services like Telegram, which offers free cloud storage for messages. Though, of course, Telegram's security model is completely different and arguably less robust than Signal's. What's particularly interesting is how this feature reveals the tension between security and convenience that's always existed in the privacy space. Signal's been so focused on security that they've sometimes made choices that hurt usability, and this backup situation has been Exhibit A for years. Now they're trying to thread the needle, maintain their security standards while actually giving users what they want. The 45-day media limit for free users is a clever bit of product design, actually. It's enough that casual users won't feel restricted. Most people probably don't need photos from months ago in their messages history, but it creates just enough friction that power users will consider upgrading. It's the kind of freemium model we've seen work in other apps, but applied to a privacy-first context. You know what this really makes me think about? The broader challenge facing privacy-focused services. How do you compete with big tech companies that can offer free services subsidized by advertising and data collection? Signal's exploring one answer here, a transparent, optional subscription for enhanced features while keeping the core service free. It'll be fascinating to see if this model works and whether other privacy-focused services follow suit. But while Signal's trying to protect our private conversations, there are governments actively trying to do the exact opposite. And that brings us to a story that has massive implications for digital privacy in Europe and potentially beyond. All right, now we need to talk about something that's got the tech community absolutely fired up. Chat control must be stopped is trending on Hacker News with over 600 points, and for good reason. This is about a proposed EU legislation that could fundamentally change how we think about digital privacy.
So here's what's happening. The EU is considering something called chat control, and the way this article describes it is pretty chilling. Imagine having a police officer permanently stationed in your home, not just visiting, but living there, watching everything you do. They're there when you're having private medical conversations with your doctor, when you're talking to your lawyer about sensitive legal matters, when you're having intimate conversations with your partner. That's essentially what chat control would do, but digitally, to every single person in the European Union. The legislation would require all services, and we're talking WhatsApp, Signal, Telegram, everything, to scan all private communications. Not just suspicious ones, not just from people under investigation, everyone's messages all the time. And yeah, they're selling this as a child safety measure, which makes it incredibly difficult to oppose without someone saying, oh, so you don't care about protecting children, right? It's a brilliant piece of political framing, honestly, even if it's deeply concerning. What really struck me in the discussion was how resigned some people seem. There's this sense of inevitability, like, well, they'll probably pass it anyway. But others are pointing out that Germany might be the key here. Apparently, they have significant influence in EU decision-making, and their position could swing this either way. Now, there was one alternative perspective that caught my eye. Someone suggested this might actually be about something bigger than just surveillance. They're arguing it could be a response to demographic tensions in Europe, a way to monitor and prevent potential conflicts between different population groups. Whether you buy that theory or not, it shows how people are trying to understand why governments would push for something so invasive.
The technical folks in the comments are also raising practical concerns. How do you even implement this without breaking end-to-end encryption? If you create a backdoor for governments, you're creating a backdoor for everyone. Hackers, foreign governments, anyone who finds the vulnerability. It's the same argument we've been having about encryption backdoors for years, but now it's wrapped up in this think of the children packaging. And you know what's wild? The article mentions that European governments are finalizing their positions on Friday, September 12, 2025. That date, that's giving people a specific deadline to act, to contact their representatives, to make noise about this. But there's also criticism about how the article itself is written. Some readers felt it was too alarmist, too much fear-mongering before actually explaining what chat control is. They wanted facts first, emotion second. The attorney-client privilege angle is particularly concerning. Think about it. If all communications are being scanned, what happens to legal confidentiality, medical privacy, trade secrets, journalist sources? The infrastructure you'd need to build for this kind of surveillance, once it exists, it's not going away. And the temptation to expand its use? I mean, we've seen this story before with other surveillance programs that started with narrow objectives and then just kept growing. What's really frustrating the Hacker News crowd is that this feels like policy being made by people who don't understand the technology. They see scan messages for illegal content as something simple, like running a spam filter, but it's not. It's fundamentally incompatible with the privacy and security guarantees that modern encryption provides. You can't have both total surveillance and secure communications. You have to choose. The comparison to having a police officer in your home really is apt, though. We wouldn't accept physical surveillance at this level. So why would we accept digital surveillance? Just because it's invisible doesn't make it less invasive. In fact, it might be worse, because at least with a physical officer in your home, you know they're there. Digital surveillance is silent, persistent, and total. And speaking of governments trying to control digital communications, we're seeing the real-world consequences of that playing out right now in Nepal, where restrictions on social media have become a flashpoint for much deeper issues.
All right, now we need to talk about something much more serious that's been unfolding in Nepal. The story that caught the Hacker News community's attention was titled 14 Killed in Anti-Government Protests in Nepal, though that number has since risen to 19 confirmed deaths. And this is where things get really complicated because the story isn't quite what it seems at first glance. So initially, the narrative that spread was that Nepal's government banned social media sites, young people got angry about losing their TikTok and Instagram, and protests erupted. Makes sense, right? I mean, we've seen how central social media is to modern life, especially for Gen Z. But here's the thing, and this is what made the Hacker News discussion so fascinating. Multiple people from Nepal jumped into the comments to say, hold on, that's not what this is about at all. What's actually happening is far more complex and, frankly, more troubling. These are anti-corruption protests, led primarily by young Nepalis who are fed up with a political system that's been dominated by the same families and parties for decades. One commenter described it perfectly. Imagine being a young person in Nepal, watching politicians' kids flaunt their wealth on social media, driving luxury cars, living these lavish lifestyles. Meanwhile, your own family members are working construction in Qatar or the UAE just to send money home for basic survival. That's the powder keg we're talking about here. The social media angle? Well, it turns out that's more of a trigger than the root cause.
The government did implement restrictions, supposedly over tax compliance issues with tech companies, and, there might actually be some truth to that part. But when you're already angry about systemic corruption and inequality, and then the government takes away one of your primary means of organizing and expressing dissent, yeah, that's when things exploded. And the response from authorities has been absolutely brutal. We're talking about police using what they call non-lethal crowd control methods. But 19 people are dead, many of them students, some reportedly still in their school uniforms. There's evidence of headshots, which tells you everything you need to know about how non-lethal these tactics really were. The situation got so bad that they deployed the Nepali army and the home minister resigned.
What really struck me in the Hacker News discussion was this tension between different perspectives on what these protests mean and where they might lead. You had local voices saying this is a legitimate uprising against corruption and nepotism, that young people are documenting and exposing the hypocrisy of the political elite. But then you also had this really thought-provoking counterpoint from someone familiar with South Asian politics who basically said, look, I sympathize with the protesters, but these movements often lack concrete policy proposals, and in this region, they frequently lead to military coups or even less democratic outcomes. They pointed to Bangladesh as a recent example. The whole situation really highlights how interconnected our digital and physical worlds have become. You can't just flip a switch on social media access anymore without massive real-world consequences, especially when people are using these platforms not just for entertainment, but as essential tools for political organization and expression. And when you combine that with existing grievances about corruption and inequality, well, we're seeing the results play out in real time. What's particularly heartbreaking is that these are mostly young people, Gen Z protesters who are essentially saying, we refuse to accept the same broken system our parents had to live with. They're using the tools of their generation to fight back, and they're paying an incredibly steep price for it. Over 300 injured, 19 dead, and the protests are reportedly still continuing despite the crackdown. The Hacker News community seemed really engaged with this story. Over 400 comments, which shows how much this resonated. And I think part of that is because it touches on so many issues that the tech community cares about. Internet freedom, the role of social media in society, digital rights, but also bigger questions about democracy, generational change, and what happens when governments try to control the flow of information in the digital age. This isn't just a story about Nepal. It's a warning about what can happen anywhere when governments misunderstand or underestimate how integral digital platforms have become to modern civic life, especially for younger generations who've never known a world without them.
What really strikes me about today's stories is how they all circle around this theme of trust and control in our digital age. Who do we trust with our code dependencies? Can we trust AI to help us with critical systems? Should we trust companies with our message backups? Can we trust governments not to abuse surveillance powers? And what happens when that trust breaks down completely, like we're seeing in Nepal? These aren't just technical problems anymore. They're fundamentally human problems that happen to involve technology. And that's exactly the kind of intersection that makes Hacker News such a fascinating community to follow. If you found value in today's episode, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss tomorrow's top stories. And remember, out of the 30 stories that appeared on Hacker News yesterday, these were the 5 that really got people talking. Until next time, keep questioning, keep building, and keep that healthy skepticism about anything that sounds too good or too simple to be true. This is Hacker News Daily, and we'll see you tomorrow.